Hi, I'm Bob Hunter, the tools editor for Wood magazine. If you're looking to get a router, if you maybe don't have a router at all first, I want you to consider there's several different sizes of routers to get. If you're looking at your first router, this is a good example of something that should be probably your first router. This is what they call a mid-size router. It ranges from a 1.5 horse to 2.25 horse. There's several models in that. This is a fixed base router. It comes with a 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch collets, so you can use any number of bits that are out there. It gives you a lot of options, has plenty of power. It's a good router to get for your first router. You can also buy these in combo kits, so you can get a plunge base. The motor comes out of this base, goes into the second. You can get good variability that way. It's a very helpful thing to let you plunge in and do cuts and routing that's in the middle of a field. This is a good way to start. This should be probably your first router, either one or the other, or a combo kit, good way to start. You can also put one in a router table. It gives you lots of options. If you want to look at a trim router is a good secondary router to have. And what we've got here is a field of 15 routers that we tested for Wood magazine. And a trim router is basically a one-handed router. You can use it, hold it with one hand, and they're really good for doing small, light-duty tasks, such as flush trimming, doing little hinge mortises, little 1/4 inch roundovers. That's kind of little simple roundovers, chamfers. They're really good for doing light-duty work, but they're not really meant to be your workhorse. They're meant to be the secondary kind of a router. So in order to test and find out which one of these routers is the best, we ran all of them through testing paces here, a lot of different tests to see how they would work. So I've got here, I have 9 corded models, so 9 that run on a power source, corded power, and then we've got 6 that run on battery power. So you might be thinking, wow, it's kind of skeptical of batteries. What we found was, don't be skeptical. These are very capable. So the battery power, they have plenty of power for, again, doing those lighter duty tasks. The runtime is sufficient. You can get, for the most part, anything you're doing on a project, you can get 10 to 15, 20 minutes of runtime out of it, depending on the depth of cut you're taking and the power, how much you're really exerting the motor and draining the battery. But they're very capable for that. So don't let that be a deterrent. So with a trim router, like I said, they're meant to be small, light duty stuff. So with that, they come with 1/4 inch collets only. So you can only use 1/4 inch shank router bits. So you're limited somewhat in your selection that what you can use in them. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's plenty of router bits in 1/4 inch that you can do for light duty stuff. Okay, let's talk about collets. These trim routers have 1/4 inch collets on them. They're limited in size in that. So let's take a look at this one. So we've got to take the base off, and then we can see the spindle. With the 1/4 inch, you've got a collet nut that needs to be removed to put a bit in or take a bit out. You can do this in several ways. You can use a 2-wrench system, 1 wrench to hold the spindle, another wrench to hold the collet nut, and you twist it off or tighten it back up. You can do, on some models, a collet lock, which when you push this button engages the spindle and locks it in place, and then you simply just undo the nut. And a few routers, such as this Bosch, have both systems, so you can choose whichever you like. There's really no great advantage to either system. They all work, so just whatever whatever you've got will work. Don't make that a buying decision. So with these trim routers, there's three basic types of collets. This Bosch has what we call a one-piece self-releasing collet. So as you release it, there's the collet inside. That's the part that actually grabs the shank of the bit, and it's attached to the collet nut. So when you do that, it pulls out. It's a one-piece thing, and the nice thing about it is, as you undo the nut, it's releasing its grip on the shank of the bit. That's really nice, because then you don't get any stuck, because it does happen sometimes you can get a router bit stuck in a collet. Most of the routers have what we call a 2-piece collet and nut, separate pieces. So when you take the nut, release the nut from the spindle, and you pull it out, the collet is still in there, it's on the bit, but it's a separate piece. So you get the collet that goes on the bit that grabs it, but then the nut when you do that. So what happens is, when you release this, sometimes the collet gets stuck down in the spindle and doesn't release its grip on the shank of the bit. So what you've got to do then is sometimes just work it a little bit to get it out. It doesn't happen much, but it does happen occasionally. So that's the beauty of the one piece, is that it pulls it loose and releases the bit. This one, not so much. Okay, then the third type of collet is another two-piece. So you've got a two-piece nut and collet, but the collet itself is a combination of kind of a one-piece and with a sleeve on it. So it's kind of what we'd call a slotted sleeve because it's got slots down the length of that. It works similar to the split cone two-piece, only this one's just a little bit longer, so it has a little bit more grip on the shank of the bit. But that's, again, sometimes those get stuck, don't release, but it happens occasionally. So that's another two-piece. When you're looking for a trim router, one of the best features is a variable speed motor. And what this means is that you can vary the actual RPMs of the bit as it's being spun through the wood. And you think, well, why is that important? Well, it can be for several reasons. If a smaller bit actually works better at a higher RPM, a larger bit, which again, you're limited in somewhat size, but say you have about 1.25 inch diameter bit, that actually would work better if you slow that down to somewhere in the mid-range of the RPMs. Or if you're working with woods that tend to burn, like maple or cherry, you can slow your RPMs a bit, and that can reduce some of the burning that happens. So with this, with about half of the models that we tested have variable speed. It's a really nice feature to get if you can get it. The others tend to run at the higher speed. So in that 25 to 26, 28,000 RPM setting is kind of where they go with a fixed speed. So they're always at that same speed. Most of these others go from anywhere from about 12,000 to 26, 28,000, somewhere in there. So for instance, with this Porter cable, that's the top setting. And you can slow it way down. Again, you probably don't run it at the slowest speed very often, but it's nice to have it there available. But if you're running somewhere in the middle, that's a good setting for a big, like a 3/8 or a 1/4 inch roundover. So it's a nice feature if you can get it. Not all the models do, but that's really nice. Setting a bit depth in a trim router is where it sometimes can be very crucial, because if you're setting something like a 1/4 inch roundover and you want that perfect roundover without a little fillet on the top, you want that to be perfect, and sometimes that's really hard to hit that exactly. If you're cutting too deep, you'll leave just a little bit of the square corner up there at the top of the arc. If you go too shallow, then you don't get exactly a perfect roundover. So it's really crucial to have a good depth setting system. So with all of these, you have what we call a coarse depth setting. So when you put your bit in and you're trying to set it, you just move the base. You can move your base up or down in a rough fashion like that. That gets you close to where you're wanting to be. And then when you want to fine tune the depth setting, then you've got different ways of doing it. With this one, there's a spin dial so that you can set the bit depth. You can set your bit in there. So this is unplugged, so I don't have to worry about it coming out. But if I'm wanting to set that bit depth, I can just drop that base down, and I can sight right down that and look until I find what I'm looking for. With this dial, you can get really precise setting and then lock it in. And again, you might have to do a test piece, route a little bit there to make sure that you're just right. You might have to loosen it up, readjust a little bit. So getting that set just right is crucial with some of these bits, especially roundovers. So this is a good system of doing that. Several models in this, they're very similar to this one. What they have is a two-piece locking mechanism. So the lock is on this side. When you tighten it up, it just locks it together. But then the other side is your fine adjuster. So you can grab the base and do coarse adjustments like that. But then when you really want to start dialing it in, you can do this. It's got a little sprocket here that catches in grooves there, and then it just steps it up and down. That's a good way of doing it, and you can then lock it in place. That's just a tension nut that tightens that up. Several of these have that same system. Others have a system where you have your coarse adjustment by pushing a lever that slides the base up and down, and then when you're real close to that, then you turn this dial to get your fine tuning. This Milwaukee and this Ryobi have similar systems that work really well. These are our two favorites for the fine adjustment, for being able to set a really precise bit depth. These work really, really well. So when you're doing that, you just kind of lock it in place, lock it, you're good to go, and there's your thing. Now some of these have scales on them. So this one, for example, has scales on the body of the router. Others have them at different places on rings or whatever, but the scales. We found that they, for the most part, can be accurate. They're not necessarily real intuitive. We found it easier to just go ahead and measure with a ruler or using your eye on setting the bit depth. Don't necessarily rely on those because it can be confusing sometimes. So just go ahead and measure. It's quicker to just get a combo square or a steel rule and set your bit depth that way. So for the most part, these trim routers come with one sub base. It's mounted onto the base. The base is the metal or the housing part that goes around the motor. That's called the base. The sub base is the plastic attachment that screws onto that. And most of these will have a small one, about 3-inch square, something like this, 3 to 4-inch square or circular. They're all pretty much about the same size as the base. A couple of them will have a D-shaped base. As you see, this is more of a D shape. The larger the larger the footprint of your sub base, the more stability you can have and more surface contact. Helps keep the router straight and steady. What we found with some of these was several of these routers have a 2-piece base that sits. It's a split base that screws together, and what can happen is you can get sawdust into there's a little crack there between the 2 pieces. Sawdust can build up in there and it can kind of block your visibility. So sometimes you have to take that apart to get that sawdust out of there. When we've got some of these routers, such as the rigid, there's 2 rigid, corded and cordless, they come with 2 sub bases. So they come with this one. So the round and this square base, both of these models come with both of those bases. So you can change them in and out. So just whichever one works for you. They don't really have any advantage over the other one, other than this one just has a little bit bigger footprint. So sometimes it's just nice to have that smaller one when you're working in tight spaces. The Milwaukee router comes with this one as your base. This is the one that's attached. That's a nice little sub base, but it also includes this much larger one so that you can get a larger footprint, again, to help stabilize it. And sometimes with these cordless routers, they can be a little top heavy, especially when you're using a larger battery. I've got a slimmer pack on here, one of the narrow packs. That helps to keep the stability down. It helps when you have a smaller battery. But if you're using a large pack battery, sometimes that can get real top heavy. So that's when a larger base, sub base, really helps to stabilize that router. And some of these then have narrow bit openings. So again, we're talking about you're limited in 1/4-inch shank bits, but you're also limited then by the diameter of the opening in both the base and the sub base. So if you're looking at, for example, this one is about 1 1/16 inch diameter. So anything wider than that, any bit that's larger in diameter, you're not going to be able to use with this unless you somehow either make another sub base or you cut into your base. So not a good option. So you're limited really in some of that regards, but that's not a big deal because these, again, aren't meant for those really large diameter bits. Some of the routers come with a sub base that has it's been molded with a shouldered edge, like a rabbited circle that's made for the 2-piece guide bushings. So if you're wanting to route something like a pattern routing type thing, you could use a guide bushing and a smaller diameter bit to route and make a perfect copy of something. And with the 2-piece guide bushings, you have this part sets down into that rabbited, so it's flush with the bottom of the base, and then you tighten up the other. Let's just take that base off there. So you would then put the nut on the top side. So you get that tightened up, and now you have a workable guide bushing that's got this bearing surface there with a smaller bit to put in there. So this is a good way to do that. Not every one of the routers comes with that though, so that's kind of a crucial thing if you need to use the 2-piece guide bushings. Some of the routers come with their own guide bushing, so it's kind of a proprietary bushing. It's a 5/16 diameter bushing, so you could use a 1/4-inch straight or spiral bit in there to do some flush trimming. With this kind of a bit, it's got little flanges on it, and you would have to take the sub base apart, take the screws out, and you install this inside there between them, trap it between them like 2 pieces of bread kind of sandwiched around that, put them back on and tightened up, and you have your own guide bushing ready to go. So this comes with the Makita, the 2 Grizzlies, and the Drill Master all have one of these proprietary guide bushings. These routers, the trim routers, are also often called laminate trimmers because they kind of came out of the cabinet making and installation business where craftsmen would be installing laminate countertops, and then they would have to trim those that laminate flush to the countertop. And so they would use a system. A lot of times these little trim routers would be used because they were the perfect light duty little tool to get in there and do that. We use them today a lot in woodworking for flush trimming, edge banding, or any kind of inlay banding or something if you're putting it on a front of a piece of plywood or something. So what you do there's two ways of doing that. The first and the easiest way is to get a flush trim bit. So with that you have a bottom bearing and a straight or spiral type flush trimming bit. What you do then is you're running this to where the bearing runs against the wood surface, and so it trims that overlay flush to your substrate, your plywood. And so this is a can't miss way of doing it. Real easy to get. These bits are 20, 25 bucks a piece, kind of on the bottom end. Really, really handy to have. It's almost a must-have for any kind of a use. So if you don't have one of those though, but you might happen to have a straight or a spiral bit, some of these routers come with a flush trimming guide. So what that is you mount your straight or spiral bit in the router right here, and then when you mount this trimming guide on there onto your router's edge, and then you can adjust this. There's a bearing right here that bears against the wood, so you set it to the side where you're trimming. So imagine if this is the board, the plywood, and I want to trim it there, so I need to just set that bearing right up against that same edge, lock it in, and now I have a good flush trimming surface that I can get that same effect. A little bit more setup, need to do some trial and error, so get a little bit of scrap piece to kind of make sure you're getting it set, but that works really well when you get there too. So not all of these have them. About, I think maybe 5 or 6 of them come with one of these edge guides. It's also available as an option on some others. These are not necessarily interchangeable, so if your model doesn't have one, you may not be able to use it on others. Okay, most of the trim routers that we've got out of this 15 come with what is called an edge guide. And I've got one attached here to this router, and what it amounts to is it just attaches to the side with a screw, and then you can put in whatever bit you're using, and then this fence slides back and forth. So let's say you were trying to run a groove parallel to one edge. You would put whatever size bit you need in there, set your distance that you need it to be from the edge, lock your fence in place, and then just simply route with this along the edge, and you're going to route a perfect groove that's parallel. And you can also use that for making rabbited edges. If you put it right up against the bit, there's room in the middle for that to go, so the bit, it just kind of encapsulates the bit. So if you were needing a shallow rabbet, you can just set your bit and your fence around it, and now you've got room to make a rabbited edge. So most of these come with one of those. This is a pretty handy little thing to have. So you can get this. Some of them are sold as options. So for the most part, you can get these that'll work really well. All right, let's talk about pricing now, because that's a lot of times what it's going to come down to with one of these, because if this is an accompanying router to your primary, larger, or full-size router, price becomes an issue sometimes. So with the corded routers, they're generally going to be less expensive. These corded routers run from $30 to about $130, and everything, you get everything that comes with it. So they're a really nice value to set up with. You can do, if you go into the cordless router, the battery power, then you start running into more money because you're adding the cost of a battery and a charger. Most of these routers are sold as bare tools. So if you're looking at, that means it's sold without a battery, without a charger. So if you're buying just this tool, you're getting just the router, which can be nice because if you already have a battery powered drill or circ saw or something like that might run on the same battery platform, these batteries, you already have batteries, you wouldn't have to buy that extra. You wouldn't have to buy the charger. So then you can buy these as bare tools. These cordless models range from $70 to $200. So you're already almost double the price on some of these without a battery. Then you start adding batteries, you're talking another $40 to $75 for a battery and another $50 or so for a charger, so it can add up in a hurry. That's why if you can buy these bare tools that fit your existing batteries that you already have for your cordless tools, it's a real good value and a real good way to add a nice little light duty trim router to your router lineup. So with that said, I can give you some options here, some guidance. Among the corded routers, we really like the Porter cable. This was our favorite one out of this group. It's got variable speed, it's got an LED light to help your visibility around the bit, it comes molded for guide bushings, It's just got a really easy setup for bit height setting, plenty of power, lots of good features, and it just has a real good grip point for this. So this is just a really, really good router. So if you're really looking to get one, that's a nice one to get. In the cordless models, our favorite here was the Milwaukee. This router has, again, sells them without battery, but with this smaller pack battery, it's pretty nimble. It's a little bit wider in diameter, so it's going to take a little bit more grip, but it also then has to offset that extra weight of the battery and the motor being over top like this. But this is a really good router, comes with the 2 bases, has variable speed, has an LED light, and there's also some availability, so a lot of optional accessories. This one has a plunge base, has an offset base, so several good options to get into. This is a really good router. Most of these are, really, you can't go wrong with any of them. They're all really good and they'll all work fine. If you're looking for something to just supplement, if you're like some people and you want to dedicate one of these to a single bit, let's say you put a 1/4-inch roundover in one and you don't ever want to move it again, which is a good thing because that's a pretty commonly used bit. So you could buy, for example, this Grizzly for about 35 bucks, and you can dedicate a bit to it. It's almost about as cheap as the bit itself. So then you can really do that. You can get 2 or 3 of these maybe, dedicate them to bits for really good value. So that's a good tool, good way to do that. And then you can have 2 or 3 of them, you can have one, you can have whatever you like, but they're really good accompaniment, good second router or third router to have in your woodworking shop.